Centre is here to help you, to serve you, our buyers, our project developers, consultants, to help accelerate the decarbonising of Australia's electricity system and to increase renewable energy across Australia. And I'd like to thank our sponsors. Next slide, Finn. They are ARENA, of course, who were very generous with funds, as well as Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland governments. And where our project partners include Climate KIC, the Knowledge Innovation Community, the Institute for Sustainable Futures, the Rocky Mountains Institute, who originally set up the model of the Business Renewable Centre, and of course, WWF. So here we are, webinar 3 on environmental claims. We are going to do a deep dive into this issue. Before we start, if we could have our first poll, please. Let's find out who some of you are and where you represent, which organisation or which sectors you represent. So the kinds of questions that we're being asked from our buyers, how many LGCs do you need to purchase to be 100%? How do you avoid double counting or underreporting emission savings between market and location-based methods? How do you deal with some of the inconsistent methods used in different emissions factors? There's no guidance or legislation. What do we do? And what do we do if we're 80 or 100 or 120% renewables? Is via a PPA? What kind of claims can we make? What do those different shades of green mean? So people are from sustainability. Great, we've got a good selection across that. So we'll end that poll and we'll go to the second poll, please. So what we're seeking to do today is to make this rather complicated issue a little bit less complicated by giving you some guidance to make it more accessible and to really understand a little bit more about the different options. And today we have with us Technical Director from the Business Renewable Centre, Jonathan Prendergast, who'll give a short presentation on the environmental claims topic that we generally cover through the Business Renewable Centre and our boot camps. We've got Bruce Precious, Principal Consultant from Six Capital Consulting. He'll give us about 30 minutes presenting. He's worked across a range of sustainability issues, primarily in the property sector, and he was awarded the New South Wales Green Globes Lifetime Achievement Award last year for his work over 20 years in support of Australia's sustainable property sector. And then we have about 30 minutes of questions and a panel discussion with Bruce and Jonathan. And we also have invited Manuel Werrick, who's the Senior Project Officer for Green Power, and Daniel Sheedy, the Director of the Climate Active Program from the Federal Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. So we're very pleased to have them. So let's have a look at the next poll here. So people are interested in claims around 100% renewables, net zero emissions, absolutely. All of those are very important, climate active, and so on. So I hope that by participating in our webinar today, you will get to have a clear understanding of how to make those claims. So now I'd like to hand over to Jonathan Prendergast, please. And by the way, let me just remind you, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll come to those at the end of the session. Thanks. Over to you, Jonathan.
Sorry, I was on mute. Hi, everyone. Jonathan Prendergast here from the Business Renewable Centre, Australia. I'm just going to introduce the topic, really. My expertise is more around power purchase agreements and less around greenhouse gas organisational accounting. As a starting point, I thought I'd bring up Google's sort of newsworthy announcements on their sustainability activities for a couple of reasons. Firstly, Google and Facebook really led the way in corporate PPAs in the US. So large corporates using their energy demand, their buying power, and also their sustainability objectives to sign contracts with new wind and solar farms to help them get financed and built. So it's Google and Facebook. And when that started happening 6 or 7 years ago, Rocky Mountain Institute really jumped on them and said, oh my God, what did you do there? That was amazing. How can we help the rest of corporate America achieve the same thing? And thus the Business Renewable Center in the US was born, where they created a whole bunch of tools, guides and primers to help other corporates like Walmart and IKEA and many others sign PPAs with wind and solar farms. Google, in this headline, they make it look easy. And we know for those working for corporates and other organizations in sustainability divisions, which is 44% of today's attendees, know that it's not so easy. When Google and Facebook were doing these PPAs, they certainly said that they will retire the renewable energy certificates as part of that PPA purchasing, as far as I understand, for the duration of the PPA. Over there, those RECs, as they call them, are more in the range of, say, $2 to $10 per tonne or per megawatt hour. So it's a different market here, where in Australia there have been $80, now they're around $35, and they do look to come down to that lower number in the coming years. And secondly, in their criteria of choosing wind and solar farms to contract with, they wanted to be sure it was additional, not just in terms of the RECs, but that their PPA will help a wind or solar farm get finance that wouldn't have otherwise, or in the sort of near future, so that their PPA made a difference and helped a new project get built, meaning new investment in wind and solar in the US, and what comes with that: new jobs, reduction in emissions, less use of coal and gas. So in Australia, a lot of discussion around 100% renewable or zero net carbon or other options. And in the poll result there, it seems that a lot of organisations are mostly interested, 62%, in that 100% renewable tagline. And maybe that's an intermediate step before zero net carbon, climate active and other. I'm sure Manuel from Green Power is smiling with that result, and also the project developers that have joined this discussion today will also be delighted to see that corporate Australia and large organisations really want to be 100% renewable, and that's their goal they're working to. So our internal stakeholders, our directors of finance, CFOs, CEOs, GMs, all think it must be simple. You sign a PPA or you do some other initiative and you tick a box, and then you can make these claims. And anyone working within these sustainability teams know it's a bit more complicated than that. And external stakeholders, that if you're a council, your ratepayers or the general public, or for users of Google and Facebook, etc., they think it should be simple to just do something and communicate that claim. But we know it's a bit more complicated than that. The word I came up with was vexed, and according to Google, it means a problem or an issue difficult and much debated, problematic. So environmental claims can be challenging. Also, in terms of additionality, it really is multifaceted. The historic way in Australia is to buy and retire LGCs in terms of energy. We sit here from the US that corporates ensure that their PPA is enabling new investments, so a new project. That can be challenging due to the scale of wind and solar farms in Australia compared to the size of our corporates and large organisations. And also that the NEM connection has become a bit more risky lately, so it's hard to deal with new projects and manage that risk. And whilst this is a 60 to 90 minute webinar today, I hate to say up front, but there is no simple black and white solution for all organisations. And that's why we're hearing from Bruce today, and also our panelists from Green Power and Climate Active. But a few more slides on the topic of PPAs. So in terms of corporate renewable activity that BRCA is seeing with its buyer members, the original initiative was to buy green power. Then green power LGCs went from $20 or $40 to $80, and also large-scale wind and solar PPAs became an option, and their price came down and the wholesale price of electricity went up. So we saw a lot of corporates and other organisations move into large-scale wind and solar PPAs and renewable retail PPA agreements. Then they have to decide, are we going to retire the LGCs as part of that PPA or not, option 2, or maybe they decide or commit to retire later. So if they have a 100% renewable energy target by 2025 or 2030. They may commit as part of this PPA announcement that they will retire from that time. Also, we have seen some LGC contracts. So there was the Solar Trams initiative by Victoria Government buying LGCs under contract from Bannerton Solar Farm from memory. And also the New South Wales Government, a huge energy user, buys LGCs via its retailer part of the energy use with an LGC contract with Dubbo Solar Farm. And also, obviously, a lot of investment in solar and renewables. So most attendees today their organisation will have invested in rooftop solar, either an STC or an LGC project. And then we see utility scale solar investments. So University of Queensland, Sunshine Coast Council and Sun Metal Zinc have all in Queensland, invested in and own large solar assets in Queensland. And also we're starting to see more investment in battery storage, EV charging, and then the myriad of sustainability initiatives. So a tagline I'd like to steal from Nick Midlam from City of Sydney is, they're all different. None of these are bad. They're all good things and they're all different shades of green. So whilst what Google did with signing large scale PPAs and retiring the RECs is kind of the ultimate, plus looking at all their other emissions, scope 1 and maybe even scope 3, all of these initiatives are good. So let's not be too ideological about this, that we want to encourage activity in this space by corporates and organisations and not discourage it by hard black and white rules. BRCA has a number of tools, guides and primers, and we have a deal structures primers where we provide some guidance on environmental claims. And this particular part of it, this extract, talks about what you can say under various PPA scenarios. So if you surrender LGCs, you can now say we procure enough renewable energy to meet 100% of our annual demand, and this has reduced our emissions by this. Without LGCs, an organisation might say they signed a PPA with this wind or solar farm, and that will generate the equivalent amount of electricity as our organisational demand. And then there's that later LGC surrender on our pathway to 100% renewable and so on. And we do note there, organisations must ensure that any environmental claims made are not misleading to the public and the market. And the ACCC has published guidance on green marketing and related claims. This is a slide I've seen in many organisations around Australia when assessing corporate PPAs. Where do we start? Our current scope 2 emissions. We've done some rooftop solar, we're going to do some efficiency, but then we might have some growth in demand, a new building or shopping centre or whatever it may be. And then the offsite PPA looks to resolve those remaining emissions. But how much to buy? Is it the 100%, 80% or so on? So if we look at those scope 2 emissions and annual net electricity use, it might be that we buy 100% via a renewable PPA or a wholesale PPA directly with a wind or solar farm. But then we remember that for every 100 megawatt hours of electricity we buy from a retailer, 20% is of that is renewable via our retailer. They buy LGCs and retire them with that in mind. And there is the option to self-supply those LGCs to your retailer if you are buying them under PPA or from your own solar farm or elsewhere. So that would suggest you only need to buy 80%. But maybe you want to self-supply and be 100%. So is 120% the answer? I'll give you the heads up from what I think Bruce will present is the answer is no. And then there are some organisations saying, well, can we use LGCs to cover our scope 1 or 3 emissions? And I think the answer is no on that one, but we'll hear from Bruce soon. And finally, it's important not to stop action. So we don't want to be in this spiral of kind of no action, where we look at the business case of going renewable via a large-scale investment or PPA, and then we say, well, the business case doesn't quite stack up if we're going solar and being renewable, so let's sell the LGCs to make the business case stack up. But then we go, oh, but then we're not reducing our emissions. So then you decide to retire LGCs, and then you're reminded the business case doesn't stack up. So let's take a pragmatic approach to all this and find the best solutions and not to let it stop our activity. Just my final slide, there are my details, but you can easily get that off our website and so on. So I'll stop sharing and hand back to Monica for the time being.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Very clear and some really good questions that have been raised that we'll look to answer in this discussion. So now I'm going to hand it over to Bruce Precious, who is the Principal Consultant of Six Capital Consulting. And Bruce, there you are. You can start sharing your screen now.
Hello, everybody. I hope that you can all see my screen. I've shared screen. You should see a
it's all good.
Screen with a logo. Thank you, Monica. Thanks for the feedback. Wonderful to join this discussion today, and thanks to the Business Renewable Centre for setting up an important discussion. It's important because number one, electricity consumers should be able to selectively purchase renewable energy and make that determined decision to buy renewable energy. The market should support that activity, and it's then important that they're able to communicate the steps that they've taken and the action that they've taken, both in supporting renewable energy and reducing emissions. So carbon claims and scope 2 emissions we are going on a bit of a deep dive today. A disclaimer at the get-go. The aim is to devex, unvex, or disvex the complications around scope 2 and carbon claims. So the intention is to simplify and to provide some direction around guidance and frameworks that are accepted globally in the measurement of scope 2 emissions. But I'm certainly no lawyer, and I'm not an accountant. But I'm somebody that's had a direct interest in carbon accounting now for a long period of time. And there's a health warning there. If you've been involved in drawing together carbon accounts for previous years, the method of carbon accounting that we're going to introduce today, if you're not familiar with it, the market-based carbon accounting method, has the potential to do your head in, because it throws out a whole bunch of principles and concepts that we're used to applying in the carbon accounting space. So that's the warning. It will challenge those preconceptions and might take you a little time to get your head around, but work through it patiently and diligently. I reflect back to around 1997. I joined the New South Wales Sustainable Energy Development Authority. And one of the techniques we used to use when we were in business planning was to imagine headlines that we'd like to see in the future. And one of those headlines that we put up on I can distinctly recall putting it up on the easel was net zero emission buildings in 2020. And it's a delight to be able to talk to that as a realisation now. So over 20 years ago, it was something that we could only imagine. But it's something that is now being delivered. The reason for the large commercial property sector to be very interested in this topic will become pretty clear. But the work that I draw on in this presentation was really funded and guided by, at first, Stockland and GPT, because of particularly GPT's net zero emissions ambitions. And as the work developed, then some of the other Property Council of Australia members joined in to fund and guide their work. So I thank them for the contribution that they've made. The reason that they were interested in devexing the Scope 2 emissions piece was that quite a number of those organisations had either made or are about to make significant commitments in terms of net zero emission futures. And here you can see a little bit of a timeline of the different organisations and the commitment periods that they've made. And one in particular, the GPT Wholesale Office Fund, was one that set a very ambitious target of 2020 for net zero emissions. And when you look at that pie chart that's sort of in the background there, the most significant portion of emissions, just around 80% on average, is from electricity emissions. So resolving Scope 2 claims and how to measure and manage Scope 2 was critical to the success of these net zero claims. A bunch of those organisations that are listed down on the left-hand side have signed up to the Advancing Net Zero program, which sets 2030 as the latest date to have existing portfolios achieve net zero emissions. And Australian property companies are well overrepresented in this global initiative that's coordinated by the World Green Building Council, which is something to be proud of. I mentioned that the GPT, their managed fund, the Wholesale Office Fund, had set the ambitious target of 2020. And the guys at GPT have been practicing a little bit to be sure that they've got the techniques and the methods right to understand how to achieve certified net zero emissions on their properties. And one of their case study trial buildings is Workplace 6 in Pyrmont in Sydney. And somewhat this is a vision of the future that we would like to see, I would suggest. It's an efficient building running on renewable energy. So it's a NABERS Energy 5-star building, NABERS Waste 4-star, NABERS Water 4-star, and it purchases 100% renewable electricity. It did so throughout 2019. It will continue to do so. And interestingly, this building has Google as a tenant. So in combination, the owner and the tenant have made this an extremely low emission building. As I said, the kind of future that we want to see. And it's, climate active certified through the NABERS program process. The other case study trial building is 8 Exhibition Street, Ernst Young building, otherwise known as, through a similar process of certification using NABERS rating as the sort of gateway, but being certified climate active and 100% renewable electricity again. So GPT has 2 of the 14 certified climate active buildings. The Wholesale Office Fund has a further 15 buildings that will be certified in this year, and that's around $8.9 billion worth of premium office assets. And importantly, both of these buildings, these trial buildings, were certified climate active using the market-based carbon accounting method that I'll describe in a little more detail today. Just to answer the question as to why the Wholesale Office Fund jumped to 2020 for a net zero emissions commitment, they jumped there once the fund manager, we were able to explain to the fund manager that zero emission buildings are efficient buildings powered through renewable energy. His response was, well, that sounds like something that we can do today. So he set the 2020 target, which meant that there was some accounting practice to be resolved. There were some questions around how to measure renewable energy. And some of those questions are listed out here, and a bit of a case study again. In the ACT, we know from the press clipping on the right that the ACT had committed to 100% renewable energy, and I understand that that came into play from October last year. And the commitment was through 2020 they'll achieve zero emission electricity across the ACT, across the territory. And the question is, does that mean that everybody that has operational facilities in the ACT, does that mean that their Scope 2 emissions are zero? And none of the certification schemes or qualification schemes really spoke to that, and it remained an open question. As Jonathan alluded to, if renewable energy in the grid is already at 20%, do I still need to buy 100% green power to have zero Scope 2 emissions? That's reflects a little bit on the ACT situation. It only gets worse beyond the 20% if states and territories put in place more ambitious goals. But there was a distinct opportunity for double accounting to occur there, double counting or under accounting. Another question was, how much carbon does a megawatt hour of electricity save? It used to be a tonne. It used to be written into the green power rules that a megawatt hour of electricity is a tonne of CO2. But that doesn't hold true anywhere, I don't think, in Australia anymore. There's also a question of, if I purchase a renewable energy certificate from South Australia, where the emission factor is around 0.5, and retire it against a property in Victoria where the emission factor is over 1, just how much carbon did I save? And then a further question, a little more complex, but does the 20% renewable energy target, which is a national target, does it ensure that there's an equivalent amount of renewable energy generated in every state? These are some of the questions that were a little vexing in understanding how we could reliably achieve and make a claim of 100% renewable electricity. Around the same time that we started to look into these questions, earlier last year, there was a report released under the Low Carbon Living CRC, Phil Harrington and Hugh Sadler. I hope they don't mind if I declare them as carbon boffins, had recognised similar issues. There was the potential that renewable energy would be either double counted or under recognised in claims. And their document suggested that what we needed to do was to pick up international best practice as set out in the World Business Council's Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and in particular, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 guidance. Around the same time of 2019, the C40 group of councils were wrestling with similar questions. How do we determine carbon neutrality for cities and manage residual emissions? And they had equally come to a conclusion that they should adopt the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 guidance. So that's the document that I'll refer to most often during the rest of this presentation. The document on the left, freely available through ghgprotocol.org. The Scope 2 guidance document was released in 2015. It's an amendment to the original Greenhouse Gas Protocol, corporate standards, and it becomes an incorporated part of the protocol. It's not. It's a mandatory component of the protocol. Late in 2018, there was also an update to the ISO standard 14064, which opens the door and mirrors the market-based method that's described in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So there's some alignment across those two standards. And since that time, all of these groups have also picked up the Scope 2 guidance document from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and made it mandatory. So if you're reporting under the Carbon Disclosure Project, they ask that you report using both location-based and market-based methods, as do RE100, as does the Global Reporting Initiative, as does the World Green Building Council, C40 group of councils. So it's the common global standard now for making market-based claims. So let's have a look at what the Scope 2 guidance document says. And in summary, it says if you have facilities or operations in a country or an area that has tradable certificates, then you shall report greenhouse gas emissions using two methods, the location-based method and the market-based method. You shall report using two methods. Again, you don't get to choose one or the other. You are required to report using both. And it identifies Australia as one of those countries that has a reliable system of contractual, what they call in generic terms, contractual instruments, which means that we have renewable energy certificates that are a reliable record of generation of renewable energy. And we have an effective register and marketplace for those certificates. So Australia is called out as one of those countries that has that condition of contractual instruments. So that means that anybody that's reporting emissions in Australia using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is required to report using both location-based and market-based methods. There's not a choice in it. So what's the difference between these two methods? Let's have a look at a really simple example of location-based reporting. And it's what we're most familiar with. We've got a power station, and there's probably more than one on the left-hand side, supplying power across into a city of buildings. And we've got a state emission factor, and this is for illustration only, so of 1.25 kilograms CO2 per kilowatt hour. And we would have got that emission factor from our national greenhouse gas accounts workbook that's published by the government each year. That's the method that we're most used to using. It's the closest to the NGERS method if you're required to report under the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme. So that's the one that we're used to applying. The second method is the market-based method, and I'll use a slightly more complex but probably more reflective of our grid situation in this illustration. So here we've got a number of different power stations, a number of different sources of electricity down the left-hand side. We've got our original coal-fired power station up the top. It's 70% of the supply in this example. Its emission factor hasn't changed. It's still 1.25 kilos of CO2. And then we have 20% of supply into the grid coming from generators that are supplying under the renewable energy target. So they're generating renewable energy certificates, and retailers, as the liable parties, are retiring those certificates to meet their obligations under the renewable energy target. The renewable energy supplied under that target is recognised as having a zero emission factor. And that's a precedent that Green Power and others have long held. Green Power having set that mark well before the renewable energy target came into being. Then, just for illustrative examples again, another 10% of electricity supply is coming from other renewable energy generators that have voluntary measures related to them. So the purchase and retirement of LGCs, large-scale generation certificates, or the purchase of green power is covered under that 10% of voluntary measures supply. So we've got that diversity of supply, and again, sorry, that's emission factor of zero. We've got that diversity of generation on the left-hand side, and over on the right-hand side, our little case study building there is going to be a building that is currently purchasing 50% green power, as an example. Now, in the text box up the top there, we've calculated the average grid factor is now 0.875 because we've introduced renewables, and that's diluting the emission factor, and we're seeing the emission factor come down, and that's what we've seen happen. The South Australian case is the extreme one. We've seen the emission factor come down very rapidly. And market-based reporting introduces a new factor, which is one of those little complications that comes along, but it's not nothing to be scared of. The market-based reporting relies on a new factor called the residual mix factor, and you'll see in a moment exactly how that's used. But the residual mix factor is the carbon intensity of the grid once you take the renewable energy components back out. So for those people that aren't buying renewable energy, that maybe aren't exposed to the RET, just how carbon intensive is the remainder of the supply? So residual mix factor, you'll see how that's applied in a moment. I hope those case studies make sense. So keep them both in mind, and we'll do the carbon account for them. And first off, we'll do the location-based carbon account for this building. And we're only looking at Scope 2 emissions. We're not looking at Scope 1 or Scope 3. And our case study building is using 100 megawatt hours of electricity. So that's our activity that we get off the electricity bills. And we've looked up the national greenhouse factors, and for the state that we're in, the emission factor, the blended emission factor, which has got all of those renewable generators factored in already, that emission factor is 0.875, which gives us 87.5 tonnes of emissions. Now, a method that we used to use if we were purchasing green power was to then say, well, we bought 50 megawatt hours of green power, so we'll apply that to the location-based reporting at a negative, maybe a -1 or a negative 0.875 emission factor. But in doing that, we've accounted for the renewable energy twice, and we would end up with an overlap in the accounting, some double accounting occurring there. So that's something that the Scope 2 guidance document, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol document, warns against doing. And that's why the need to introduce market-based reporting. So we'll go to that second table, market-based reporting. And the first thing that you have the opportunity to do is to break the electricity consumption down into its generation source. So we know in our case, in rough numbers, we have 20% of our electricity being supplied under the renewable energy target. And it's renewable electricity with an emission factor of 0. So we roll that across into our emissions column, emission factor 0 for 20 megawatt hours of our supply. And we know that we purchase 50% green power. So we've purchased 50 megawatt hours of green power. Again, emission factor 0, 0 emissions. And in this case, where we have a residual, we have 30 megawatt hours of regular electricity. And the emission factor we need to apply to that is the residual mix factor, which we spoke of earlier, which was that carbon intensity of the grid if we take all of the tradable renewables out, just how carbon intensive is the remainder. So that was the 1.25 kilos of CO2 per kilowatt hour that we have there, and that gives us a total emissions number. So you'll see that the under location-based and market-based reporting, you can't compare the final emissions number. They're different numbers. They will nearly always be, there's a rare case where they'll be equivalent, but they'll nearly always be different. And they're supposed to be different because they're measured using different methods. Now, the way the protocol justifies having two methods is that it says, well, location-based reporting is important when you're communicating your emissions to any interested stakeholder. It's important because it gives that consumer of the information a view of just how emission intensive the community is that your facilities operate in. The market-based reporting gives the stakeholder a perspective on what you've done about it. What action have you taken to purchase renewable energy, and how has that reduced your emissions? So it justifies reporting using two numbers. I can't imagine how hard it must have been having a big global committee of people around the table. The best answer they could come up with was to report under using two quite different methods. But that's the best resolution they could come to, and has now been supported and adopted globally. So I'm going to pause there. If there are any immediate questions, particularly about these tables, that we should respond to before we move on to a little bit more discussion.
Bruce, Jonathan Prendergast here. I remember when I saw that table, I realised the impact of even minor green power purchases or LGC surrender that can really sort of magnify your emissions reductions under the market-based reporting in this method.
Agreed. I think it makes it very clear, and really importantly, it puts you onto that trajectory. I mean, if I was still in a large corporate commercial property firm and I took the market-based reporting number to the management team, their immediate question would be, why did we only buy 50% green power? Can't we just make that can't we just buy 100% renewable energy and we're done? It makes the resolution of Scope 2 emissions very clear. It's in the emissions are in your hands. You have a choice to buy renewable energy and resolve that.
So Bruce, one of the questions that is in the chat is the emissions factor for market reporting based on a national figure set under the national accounts.
There are no laws or precedents for this. Because we have a national renewable energy target, and the renewables that have been commissioned to respond to that target, while every consumer around the grid has paid their portion, they aren't allocated equally across the states. There is a predominance of those big RET generators in South Australia, for instance, but everybody around the grid has made their contribution. So because we have a national renewable energy target, in generating a residual mix factor, the conclusion that certainly our friends in the Property Council have come to is that a national residual mix factor makes most sense. Trying to come up with state-based residual mix factors gets you definitely into a vexing situation of trying to allocate renewable generation across state boundaries, which is just makes no sense at the end of the day. So I'll speak to residual mix factor in a little bit more detail on the next slide as well.
There's one other question. We've got a 50% green power market-based example. What happens if we buy 80% green power?
Yeah, so then we've achieved our 100% renewable energy ambition in that case, and that's something that I'm sure Manuel will speak to from Green Power. There is a consultation process that's being undertaken by Green Power at the moment to explore some of these strategies and to determine how Green Power should respond. Climate Active has also just undertaken consultation in this same space. So it's something that has seen a lot of people in the market moving to understand and hopefully move towards.
Bruce, Jonathan again. So in my earlier slides, I talked about 100% purchase of renewables, and then option 2 is an 80% purchase. And then the buyer might like to buy the extra 20% to self-supply to their retailer. And the reason being, when you buy electricity and your retailer is buying LGCs on your behalf and retiring them for 20% of your annual demand, they put that line item on your electricity bill, and you have little control over that fee apart from the initial tender. And it's not very finely managed. And the opportunity is, if you make a long-term commitment to a renewable project, you can get LGCs at a lower price, at say the equivalent of $5, $10, $15 per megawatt hour, rather than the current price of say $38. Plus, also organisations would like the idea that they're using LGCs from a project they have a relationship with. It's more tangible in that way. So there still might be some corporates that see this and say, well, let's go 100% purchase, 80% for our market-based reporting, and 20% so we can self-supply our renewable energy target portion in your line item. Does that sound right?
Yeah, entirely valid. A sophisticated purchaser, as you say, particularly one that has a long-term agreement with a generator, could certainly pursue that strategy of including the RET contribution in that purchase, and effectively directing the retailer where to source their LGCs from, or how to source them, and how they'll be retired.
So Bruce, let's carry on. We've got quite a few questions coming through, so let's.
Thanks, Monica. Let's make sure we've got plenty of room for those. So I said I'd elaborate on the residual mix factor. Some people have seen this as a bit of a stumbling block, because it's not a factor that's published by the Australian government with their greenhouse factors workbooks. I think they have all the information that they would require to publish it, but they don't at the moment. First off, it's very important to remember that the residual mix factor only applies to those people that aren't buying 100% renewable energy. So if your goal is to purchase 100% renewable energy, the residual mix factor is redundant. You don't use it. You don't need it. So there is no stumbling block in that scenario. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol gives guidance. If the residual mix factor is not available, then their advice is to use the applicable location-based factor. That's an option. What the Property Council has agreed to do is to say, well, actually, we can come up with a pretty reasonable estimate of the residual mix factor by taking the national Scope 2 emission factor, which is published in the Greenhouse Gas Workbook. We'll take the national factor and we'll gross it up, if you like. We'll factor it up by the percentage of renewable energy in the grid. So the Clean Energy Regulator publishes a renewable power percentage currently, 19.3% for this year. We factor the national grid emission factor up by that 19% to give us a very reliable estimate of the residual mix factor. And remembering that the residual mix factor won't be used all that significantly if you're moving to 100% renewable energy. I do want to quickly touch on what happens if you have, say, on-site solar. If you have a large-scale solar generator on your property that's supplying electricity behind the meter. If you're the bad news is if you're selling the LGCs related to that generator, then you forego the opportunity to claim the renewable energy and the emission reduction from that system, because, and here's a principle of the Scope 2 guidance document, is that it relies on the basis of unique claims. Now, if you sell the certificates and somebody else uses those certificates and retires them either against the renewable energy target or retires them voluntarily to support their renewable energy claim, you could end up making a duplicate claim under the same certificate. So under that principle of unique claims, if you've sold the LGC, then you've foregone your claim opportunity. So that's an important point to make. If you're in that situation though, of course you can claim the responsibility for putting that solar project in place, for generating X megawatt hours of electricity. You can nominate that as a project. There are other methods to demonstrate to your stakeholders the significant initiative that you've taken to put the solar on site. And here, just to be really clear in how the Scope 2 guidance document set out to handle situations where there are what they've called supplier quotas and what we call the renewable energy target. That highlighted box down the bottom. For example, if a utility is required to procure and deliver renewables for 20% of its total retail load, then voluntary contractual instruments would be required to account for the remaining 80% of the delivered energy. So our example exactly, and the guidelines make it quite clear the response that they expect. And on the right-hand side there, that you can see a snippet from the Clean Energy Regulator website, which sets out that 19.3% of renewables in the grid for 2020. So I hope that demystifies that section a little bit. In terms of the certificates that we're using in Australia, the renewable energy certificates that we're creating from renewable energy generators and then retiring either under the RET or under voluntary retirement. Both of the standards, the ISO standard and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, talk to the quality of the certificates that we use. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in particular highlights Australian certificates as being amongst the highest quality of form of certificate, because they meet these criteria. They convey the information associated with the certificate. So we know that 1 REC is 1 megawatt hour of electricity. It's insured with a unique claim. We know that through the registry, there is transparency as to who has retired the certificate and whether that certificate has been retired in support of the RET renewable energy target or voluntarily. Certificates can be tracked, redeemed, retired under our registry, which is run by the government and is a very robust system. An interesting quality requirement here is that the certificate should be generated as close as possible to the period of the electricity consumption. And that's something that that's the one quality criteria that Green Power hasn't been using in the past, and is, I think, subject to the consultation discussions that are ongoing at the moment. But it makes sense, and it enhances the claim that you make if you can demonstrate that the electricity is being generated in the same kind of period, at least the same reporting period, as to when it's being consumed. And the electricity is being produced within the country or within the area boundaries of where your facility is located. So trading of renewable energy certificates between countries is specifically discouraged under both the ISO standard and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Scope 2 emissions.
Bruce, I'll just ask you to just hurry through the next few slides. Thanks.
Yep, will do. Just in terms of enhancing your claims, Jonathan, I think, introduced the concepts well. When you're directly contracting with the generator, when you set a long-term agreement, when you can underwrite a contract through a PPA, they're all elements that enhance the claims. They're not necessary under the protocol or the guidance, but certainly enhance your claims and demonstrate a greater commitment to the support of renewable energy. And I think respond well to the, sometimes I get the question, some people will remark, oh, well, you just bought certificates and that's all you have to do. Well, that's not all you have to do. It's a mechanism that allows you to demonstrate your support for renewable energy, which is the right thing to do, and takes us towards that future state of efficient buildings running on renewable energy. There is a renewed and refreshed perspective from the expert panel examining additional sources of low-cost abatement. Their recent analysis, they have an expectation that voluntary use of the renewable energy certificate registry will continue and they expect it to grow. And I think this is important in terms of considering how the registry continues to support claims over time. So the expert panel has identified that the registry, even though the renewable energy target is fully subscribed, the registry has an ongoing utility in supporting voluntary claims. And just that, so the final conclusion here is that the market-based method of accounting for Scope 2 emissions does avoid the under-accounting, over-accounting problems. It provides a reliable method for reporting the acquisition, the purchase of renewable electricity, relying on those principles of robust system of certificates, the auditability of those certificates, a retirement that's additional to the renewable energy target, and that principle of unique claims. Then it comes to how you make your claim, how you express that claim is, again, we would recommend, as Jonathan did, the ACCC's advice on green claims, that you're cautious about the claim you make and ensure that it's supported by the accounting. Thanks so much for all your time and attention this afternoon. I'd be happy to take questions. My contact details are on that slide. If you've got other questions beyond today's session, be in touch and see if we can continue to devex, demystify and simplify Scope 2 accounting.
That should be our objective, shouldn't it? Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bruce. I really like those examples that help to clarify. We do have a lot of questions in the Q&A as well. So I now want to hand it over for a quick 5 minutes from Manuel. Manuel, you ready to go? Manuel Werrick, who is from the Green Power Program. So we're now into our panel session, and we thought we really couldn't hold this webinar without inviting two of our friends, one from the Green Power team and one from the Climate Active Program, to give some brief comments, and then we'll field some of the questions that are coming through the Q&A chat. Thanks. Over to you, Manuel.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks very much for putting on this session. I think there is a lot of confusion out there, and it's great that we're providing, or the BRCA are providing education to people interested, especially in PPAs. So I work at Green Power. Green Power is the only government accreditation program for voluntary renewable energy in Australia. And we've existed since 1997. I'm just trying to fix my camera. Apologies for that. Our systems here sometimes play up. So yeah, we've been around for a while. We're a national program, but we're run out of New South Wales government with representations from other jurisdictions on our national steering group. People in the audience might know us from electricity bills, but also from retailer products, where you can buy green power from almost every electricity retailer in the country. And as we've seen in some of the questions, it's great that we can clean up sort of how that works in your carbon accounting as well. Green Power's key role is to make sure that we give customers assurance that if you purchase renewable energy, your LGCs or the equivalent LGCs are surrendered on your behalf by your retailer or by the responsible party, and that there's no double counting or green claims that can't be made. So we really look at everything from start to finish, from the generation side, LGC creation, all the way to a two-tiered auditing of all the providers that offer green power. But we also work through any sort of PPA arrangement. So as Jonathan mentioned earlier, Green Power was the original idea, and I think that's what we talk about. Green Power mostly, it's just through a retail product, but you can also just purchase LGCs from a Green Power accredited generator through a PPA or another arrangement, and do the voluntary surrender through a Green Power provider as well, and in that way reduce costs. I saw that there was one question in the Q&A about why is the cost of green power not going down the same as the LGC costs are going down? And I think my quick response to that is it always takes a little while for the market to respond, and also for retailers and other parties that have hedged and locked in a price for their own green power, that they can sort of pass through those costs a bit more. But I'm really keen to discuss a bit further afterwards, and yeah, leave it to the next speaker to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Manuel. That was fantastic. Wonderful to have you here. Now, I'd also like to introduce Daniel Sheedy, who is from the Climate Active team run by the federal government. I think one of the best climate programs there is globally in terms of recognising climate neutrality. So, Daniel, over to you. There you are.
Thanks, Monica. And thanks to the BRC for the invitation today. I'll try to keep my discussion brief. In fact, Bruce covered off a lot of things I was going to talk about, so that's great. And in preparing for today, I did look at the BRC membership list, and it was good to see some familiar names there. So we do share a few members, which is great. And obviously, anyone else on the call today who's interested in Climate Active, be happy to talk to you. For those of you who don't know Climate Active, it's an ongoing partnership between the Australian government and business to drive voluntary climate action. As Monica said, we sit within the Department of Industry, Science, Energy Resources, so we are actually a government-run program. With our new branding last year, some people do confuse Climate Active as a private certification, but it is run by Australian government. And it's a collective effort to measure, reduce and offset carbon emissions. So formerly called NCOS, National Carbon Offset Scheme, now rebranded to be called Climate Active, to better reflect the role of government, business and community in working together to address climate change. The focus on the brand historically has probably been B2B, and we're really trying to drive now more development in the B2C, business to consumer, action on climate, as consumers become more aware of climate change. And I think the bushfire season we had last summer is a good indication of people becoming more aware of climate change. We're seeing continued growth in our certifications traditionally through organisational certification, but we are seeing now an emergence in products and services as well. The new brand has also been designed to be a bit more flexible to emerging issues. There's a lot going on in terms of offset policy, the Paris Agreement, Article 6, with regard to international units, and more importantly to this audience is a recognition of renewables. So Climate Active supports use of renewables through people's emissions reduction statements and accounting framework. This new brand has given us the flexibility to think about developing a standalone renewable certification under the program. And we are seeing increased use of LGCs and renewables in carbon accounts. For example, Barangaroo is a big user of LGCs. Councils in the property sector, which Bruce has touched on. A lot of these people are making large investments in renewables through either on-site renewables or through PPAs. The critical factor from an accounting perspective is that any LGCs generated are retired to avoid double counting of zero emission attribute of renewables. And as Bruce touched on, we're consulting on a new accounting method, the market-based method, playing a little bit of catch-up with CDP and other certification programs. And we've put a paper out in April, which submissions are now closed, and Ben Jobson in my team is now reviewing those to look at the future of how we account for market-based methods. Monica, I might cut it short. There's a few examples I was going to give about our current and recent certifications, but people can reach out to me just to say that certification is growing. So in the last 12 months, we've doubled our certs. So we've got over 130 now, over 5 types of certification. We've got 50 registrations in the pipeline. So the program's going really well, and the property sector and others representing your audience are part of that growth.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. So we're going to go to some of the questions. I don't know if we'll be able to cover all of them today, but we'll give it a good go. And a question, some examples of Australian companies that are publicly reporting both location and market-based Scope 2 emissions. Bruce, do you know any off the top of your head, or Jonathan?
So I know that at least GPT and Dexus both started reporting market-based and location-based. There's a really nice example. If you want a global example, you download Google's most recent sustainability report, and it provides you a really, really nice chart that compares the location-based versus market-based. Really good example.
Monica,
Okay. Yep.
Liam Henderson from City of Melbourne actually answered in the Q&A.
Yes, no, I understand that, but,
Yep.
but that's councils rather than companies. So I just wanted to give some for corporates that are on the call.
Cool.
So this is a question for Climate Active. I understood Climate Active needs 100% voluntary, or is this incorrect?
Sorry, Monica, could you repeat the question?
I understood Climate Active needs 100% voluntary retirement of LGCs, I guess, or is this incorrect?
I think that's correct. We do need retirement of the LGCs, yes.
That's fine. Now, another question.
Just to clarify that, though, the situation, as I understand it, Daniel, under the sort of novel method of using market-based reporting, which those 2 GPT buildings did, then the consideration there was that it was 20%, effectively 20%, a little less. 20% was retired under the RET, and GPT,
sorry, Bruce. Yes,
GPT retired the other 80% to make up the 100. Yeah, I think
sorry, Bruce.
That
yes,
was probably where the question was headed, I think.
Right.
So in which scenario would you choose to retire 120% of LGCs? At most, would it not be 100% to account for the RET?
Maybe I can jump in there from a Green Power's perspective. So there is a bit of confusion about how Green Power deals with the renewable energy target. We were designed as an additional program to any mandated federal government targets or commitments. And so any green power that is purchased currently is additional to the renewable energy target. So a business that wants to go 100% green power currently has to purchase 100% voluntary or surrender voluntary LGCs for 100% of their energy use, which means it's in addition to the 20% roughly from the renewable energy target, and that gets them to 120%. There are some retailers that even offer 200% green power products, which means, you know, customers are out there that want to say, we are contributing to the renewable energy sector, 200% of our energy use, basically making up someone else's energy use as a sort of a voluntary commitment to the industry to support it. But following on from that point, green power is designed that way as a product offer, But we don't mandate how green power is reported as a voluntary surrender option. And so we absolutely work with an 80-20 mix as well in your carbon reporting. But yeah, at the moment, we don't allow retailers to sell a 100% green power product that isn't 100% voluntary surrenders. So just a bit of clarification there. Hopefully that helps.
So I've got a question here. If you have a large scale renewable system installed on a building, but you don't create or you don't sell your AGCs, can these still be counted as zero emissions under the market-based approach?
Yeah, I'd be happy to respond to that and say, yes, they can. The electricity generated should be recorded in your energy account because it is energy that's consumed by the facility. So in your energy account, you'd have X megawatt hours of self-generated renewable energy at emission factor 0 on the principle that you haven't generated or sold certificates using that system. So absolutely.
That's interesting, Bruce. I thought you may have to create them and then retire them, but it is okay just not to create the LGCs in the first place.
Yeah.
Great.
So a question that was early on, I'm interested in the correctness of the claim of the purchase of renewable energy if, for example, you operate a business that has a load profile that does not match a renewable energy generation profile. Is this accounted for in the calculation of the LGCs? Is a consumer's load profile relevant to the claims they make?
Can I speak to that one first? But it'd be great to hear from the other panel members. But in the US, Microsoft and Apple are both approaching this, saying, hey, we're signing 100% solar and wind PPAs, well, through multiple contracts. But if our facilities don't actually match those loads very well, is our claim as strong as we hope? And it was interesting to hear them in a podcast a year or two ago that Apple are doing heavy work on absolute load matching, where they're trying to get their facilities on-site consumption to absolutely match their renewable production. And that might be through demand management, installation of storage, or even investment in grid storage like pumped hydro or battery storage and so on. Whereas Microsoft are going to invest in all those things, demand management, battery storage, and even grid storage. But they're still going to play the market. So what that means is, just say your facility demand is high, but renewable energy generation is low, should you top that up with your storage facilities? And they're actually going to respond to the price. If the price in the market is low at that time, then there's no need to dispatch that storage. So Apple are going in a way where they will shape their load and storage to match their renewable production, whereas Microsoft are going to contract and invest in solar and wind bulk supply and storage, but ensure that works with the market in the way the market's meant to work to respond to price signals. And I think that my final comment on that would be that the beauty of our electricity grid is to bring together a whole heap of imperfect generation sources like coal, gas, hydro, wind and solar, and match it with a whole heap of imperfect customers who switch things on and off as we decide to. And it works to somehow to keep the lights on and also to hypothetically or theoretically bring the price down. So let's not fight against that system. Let's use that system and shape our load and have our storage to work with the overall national electricity market and grid as a whole, not necessarily overspend in trying to match wind and solar with our facilities perfectly all the time.
Anyone else want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I'd like to reply in my interpretation of the protocol. It's not necessary to match your profile with the generator. The protocol is relying on the fact that for each megawatt hour of consumption in a period, you can demonstrate that there's been a megawatt hour of generation in a period, and that period might be across a year. That's your normal accounting period for most people. They'll provide an annual account. If you've consumed 100 megawatt hours in a year, and then you can show that there's been 100 megawatt hours of renewable energy generated over which you can make a unique claim, then that's what the protocol relies on. But going back to what makes your claim even stronger is to work towards alignment. And it's been great to see some retailers, some innovative retailers and customers. I think it was Sydney Opera House when they announced their PPA. they also announced that they, on their calculations, they had an 80% alignment with the profile of that generator that struck the deal with. So that KPI becomes really, really interesting, I think, and reflects the care and attention they've paid to choose the most appropriate renewable energy supply for their PPA. Makes it a wonderful connection and makes the whole piece more tangible.
So there's a few questions about 100% renewable. So if a company is claiming 100% RE, say under a corporate PPA, does that require LGCs to be surrendered for 100% of the load plus the LGC liability, or is 100% surrender sufficient?
Yeah, the quick answer of what the protocol requires is the renewable energy target percentage, the quota, as it's described in the guidelines, plus your voluntary retirement. So if it's 20% under the RET, then 80% is what's necessary to get you to a 100% claim. But there are variations on that theme, but that's the sort of the minimum case, if you like, I think.
So a follow-up question was related to the market-based approach. When calculating market residual, should we be looking to estimate state-based market residual or using the national estimate discussed earlier?
Yeah, my suggestion is that trying to come up with a state-based residual mix factor takes you to a world of pain, and it won't resolve itself. You will end up under accounting, double counting somewhere along the way, and your numbers are open to challenge. Using a national residual mix factoring, in fact, using the national emission factor as a default is probably something that you can point to reliably and with the greatest robustness. So the national emission factor would be the default for residual mix factor.
All right, I think we're going to have to wrap it there. We've got still quite a few questions to answer. So I guess I want to hand it back to the panellists to give us your sort of, I guess, the key messages for the participants on our webinar today. What's the take-home message for them, please? So Jonathan, I'll hand it to you first of all.
I'll have two if that's okay, you know me. Firstly, thank you, Bruce, for doing all that research so we don't have to and presenting it so openly today. It's very important work and useful for all our members. And secondly would be that you can see that you can shape your sustainability strategy in terms of emissions and your claims, what you want to say publicly, how best suits your organisation. So it's not black and white, it has colour, and Bruce and Manuel and Dan today have added that colour to our participants today, so thank you for that.
Bruce, if I can ask you, what are the take-home messages you want to give to the participants today?
That it's the voluntary action in supporting renewables and demonstrating to your community of stakeholders your action and the emission reductions that occur because of your action are really, really important. If we can demonstrate to the community that we can have net zero emission buildings and libraries and councils and shopping centres and the like, then those very tangible outcomes are just really important, I think, for people to understand and counter some of the murky politics that just continue to surround climate action. So get out and do it. Voluntary surrender is really, really important, will continue to be important. Market-based gives you a way to account for it and make reliable claims.
Thank you, Bruce. And Manuel, what about yourself?
Yes, sure. So yeah, first of all, congratulations to Bruce for providing that level of clarity, and also to Jonathan in that introduction. I think my key takeaway for today was that slide where Jonathan presented the different claim options that people have. That's certainly supported by Green Power. We see it as a very important thing that especially corporate PPA customers, that they don't claim 100% renewable energy use if they don't do voluntary surrender to get to that 100% renewable energy claim as well. So it's really good to clarify that with your PPA partners when you negotiate those. Whenever you have any questions or doubts about it, feel free to get in touch with Green Power as well, and we're happy to provide guidance there too.
Great, thanks, Manuel. And Daniel?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Again, thanks to Bruce. I think everyone's thanking Bruce today for getting us through that complicated information. I know it's helped me a lot. My team have tried to explain that market-based approach to me a number of times. Basically, my takeaway is that Climate Active recognises renewables, and obviously we're trying to adapt and keep our standard up to best practice. So we're looking to align with what's happening in the market to make sure we are a best practice standard.
Thanks, Daniel. As my favourite frog said, it's not easy being green, but there's opportunities and different shades of green today. So really want to thank all the panellists who participated and all of you on our webinar. And of course, you know, we in the Business Renewable Centre are available to respond to some of your questions. Bruce has said, you know, be in touch with him, Manuel the same. Jonathan Prendergast, our Technical Director, is always happy to hear from you if you've got more questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to do a deeper dive into some of the more technical questions around STCs as well as Scope 3, but we've got to do a wrap. So thank you again. And just so you know, our next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 24th of June, and it will be on the subject of social licence, which I think will be of real use to many of you who are in corporate and council, who are wanting to make your commitments and want to make sure that the projects that you put your name to are projects that you can be very proud of and that retain your reputation and deliver against all of your sustainability goals, not just environmental, but your social sustainability goals. So stay tuned for that. If you aren't a member of the Business Renewable Centre, please get in touch with us. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find the Business Renewable Centre on LinkedIn. And we're happy to help you and serve you. So thanks very much, and we'll say bye now. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Monica.
Everyone, bye.
Cheers.